The amber glow of Edison bulbs cast long shadows across the worn wooden tables of the examined life. A small philosophical cafe tucked between a used bookstore and a vintage record shop in Berkeley. Rain drummed against the tall windows, creating rivers of distortion that blurred the neon signs across the street. It was nearly midnight on a Tuesday, and the cafe was almost empty, save for a few graduate students hunched over laptops and steaming mugs. In the far corner, beneath a faded poster of Socrates, sat a man in his early 30s with gentle eyes and calloused hands. He wore a simple flannel shirt and held a cup of chamomile tea, watching the rain with the contentment of someone who had found peace in small moments. This was Marcus, though tonight he carried within him the spirit and wisdom of Epicurus, the ancient Greek philosopher, who had spent his life teaching that happiness was humanity's highest goal. The cafe's door chimed as another figure entered, shaking raindrops from a worn leather jacket. This newcomer was tall and angular, with intense eyes that seemed to pierce through everything they gazed upon. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, and there was something restless about his movements, as if he were wrestling with invisible demons. He carried himself like a man perpetually on the edge of some great revelation or terrible despair. Tonight he embodied the tortured genius of Søren Kierkegaard, the Danish philosopher who believed that true existence required confronting life's fundamental anxieties. The Kierkegaard figure, let's call him Samuel, ordered a black coffee and scanned the nearly empty cafe. His eyes fell upon Marcus, who had returned to gazing peacefully out the window. Something about that tranquil expression irritated Samuel. In a world full of suffering and meaninglessness, how could anyone sit so contentedly? "Mind if I sit?" Samuel asked, already pulling out the chair across from Marcus. Marcus looked up with a warm smile. "Please, join me. A night like this, we might as well share the warmth." Samuel sat down heavily, his coffee cup hitting the table with more force than necessary. "You look remarkably at peace for someone living in such a chaotic world." "Chaos is often just complexity we haven't learned to accept," Marcus replied, taking a slow sip of his tea. "I find most of life's supposed chaos disappears when we stop fighting against what we cannot control." "How convenient," Samuel said, his voice carrying a sharp edge. "Tell me, do you think happiness is the goal of human existence?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Marcus studied Samuel's face, noting the tension around his eyes, the way his fingers drummed restlessly against his coffee cup. "That's quite a question for a Tuesday night," Marcus said with a gentle laugh. "But yes, I believe happiness, properly understood, is indeed what we should all be striving for. Not the shallow pleasure-seeking that people often mistake for happiness, but genuine contentment, peace of mind, freedom from unnecessary suffering." Samuel leaned forward, his intensity palpable. "And there lies the great deception of our age. This pursuit of happiness you speak of, it's nothing more than sophisticated cowardice, a way of avoiding the fundamental anxiety that defines authentic human existence." "Cowardice?" Marcus raised an eyebrow, still maintaining his calm demeanor. "I'd say it takes considerable courage to choose contentment over constant turmoil." "No," Samuel said, his voice growing more passionate. "True courage lies in facing the abyss of human existence, in acknowledging that we are fundamentally alone, that our choices define us in the most terrifying ways possible. Your happiness is just another form of hiding from the truth." The rain grew heavier outside, and the few remaining patrons began to gather their things. The barista behind the counter glanced at the clock, 12:30. Usually he'd start hinting about closing time, but something about the intensity of the conversation at the corner table made him hesitate. Marcus set down his teacup and leaned back in his chair. "You speak of truth as if suffering were somehow more authentic than joy, but tell me, what truth is there in unnecessary anguish? What wisdom comes from choosing despair when contentment is possible? The wisdom of recognizing that contentment, as you call it, is often just unconsciousness wearing a prettier mask," Samuel replied. "When you eliminate anxiety, when you smooth away all the rough edges of existence, you eliminate the very thing that makes us human, our capacity to become who we truly are through struggle and choice." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I see we have quite different perspectives on what it means to live well. Perhaps we should explore this further. After all, it's not often one encounters someone so passionate about the virtue of suffering, and it's not often I meet someone so determined to avoid the depths of human experience," Samuel countered, but there was a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth now. Despite their disagreement, He was beginning to appreciate his conversation partner's willingness to engage seriously with these questions. The barista approached their table. "Gentlemen, I hate to interrupt, but we're closing soon. Can I get you anything else?" Marcus looked at Samuel. "What do you say? Are you interested in continuing this discussion? I know a 24-hour diner about 3 blocks away. Nothing fancy, but they serve decent coffee and won't mind philosophical debates." Samuel considered for a moment, then drained his cup. "Very well, but I warn you, I have no intention of being converted to your gospel of contentment. And I have no intention of abandoning my belief in human happiness," Marcus replied, standing and leaving a generous tip on the table. "This should be an interesting night." The Chrome Palace Diner was exactly what its name suggested. All stainless steel surfaces and red vinyl booths, unchanged since 1957. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh white light that made the late hour feel even more surreal. A lone waitress moved between empty tables, refilling salt shakers and humming softly to herself. Marcus and Samuel settled into a booth near the back, their coffee cups creating small islands of warmth in the stark environment. The contrast between the cozy cafe they'd left and this sterile setting seemed to sharpen the edges of their philosophical divide. "So," Marcus began, stirring honey into his fresh cup of coffee, "let me understand your position. You believe that happiness is somehow inauthentic, that we should embrace anxiety and suffering as more genuine forms of human experience." Samuel wrapped his hands around his coffee mug, as if drawing warmth from it. "It's not that I advocate for suffering as an end in itself, but I believe that the kind of happiness you promote, this pursuit of pleasure and avoidance of pain, leads to a fundamental dishonesty about the human condition." "How so?" "Because it encourages us to live on the surface of existence, to avoid the depths where real transformation occurs. Think about it. When have you grown the most as a person? During moments of contentment, or during periods of struggle, uncertainty, even despair?" Marcus considered this, his expression thoughtful rather than defensive. "I've learned as much from joy as from sorrow. When I watch a sunset and feel that deep sense of peace, when I share a meal with friends and experience genuine connection, when I help someone in need and see their gratitude, these moments teach me about what it means to be human just as much as any struggle." "But those moments you described," Samuel said, leaning forward, "they're fleeting. They come and go like waves. What remains constant is the underlying anxiety of existence, the fact that we must choose who we become, that we're responsible for our own meaning-making, that we face death and limitation, and the possibility that nothing we do ultimately matters. And you think we should focus on that anxiety rather than those moments of joy? I think we should face it honestly. Your philosophy of happiness encourages people to distract themselves from these fundamental realities. You teach them to seek pleasure and avoid pain, but in doing so, you rob them of the opportunity to become authentic individuals." Marcus shook his head slowly. "I think you misunderstand what I mean by happiness. I'm not talking about constant pleasure-seeking or avoiding all discomfort. True happiness, what we might call ataraxia or tranquility, comes from understanding what we can and cannot control, from forming deep friendships, from living simply and appreciating what we have." "But that's exactly my point," Samuel said, his voice growing more animated. "Your tranquility is achieved by limiting yourself, by deciding in advance what's worth worrying about and what isn't. You create a safe little bubble of contentment and call it wisdom. And your approach? My approach acknowledges that we are beings capable of infinite possibility and infinite responsibility. Every choice we make defines us. We cannot escape into some predetermined notion of what should make us happy, because we must continually choose who we are becoming." The waitress approached with a coffee pot, topping off their cups without speaking. In the kitchen, someone was washing dishes, the rhythmic clatter providing a mundane backdrop to their intense discussion. Marcus took a sip of his coffee and studied Samuel's face. "You speak of infinite possibility, but you seem to carry the weight of the world on your shoulders. Tell me honestly, are you happy? Do you experience joy?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee. "Happiness, in the way you mean it, feels like betrayal to me. How can I be content when there's so much suffering in the world? How can I seek my own pleasure when others are in pain? And beyond that, how can I rest in any feeling when I know that every moment I'm choosing who I am, and that choice carries absolute responsibility?" "But that's precisely why I believe in the importance of happiness," Marcus replied gently. "If we cannot find peace and contentment in our own lives, how can we hope to alleviate suffering for others?" If we're constantly tormented by anxiety and despair, what good can we possibly do in the world? The good that comes from authentic engagement with existence, the good that emerges when we stop hiding behind comfortable philosophies and face the reality of our condition. When we acknowledge our fundamental freedom and the anxiety that comes with it, we open ourselves to genuine transformation. Or we open ourselves to madness and despair. Sometimes those are the same thing. Sometimes you have to risk everything to become who you really are. Marcus leaned back in the booth, his expression serious but not unsympathetic. I've seen too many people destroy themselves and others in the name of authenticity. There's something to be said for the person who can find contentment in simple pleasures, who can maintain their equanimity in the face of life's inevitable challenges. And I've seen too many people sleepwalk through existence, calling their unconsciousness wisdom, Samuel countered. Your contentment may be admirable, but is it truly alive? When you eliminate anxiety, do you also eliminate passion, creativity, the capacity for genuine love? Now that, Marcus said, with the first hint of sharpness in his voice, sounds like the kind of false dichotomy that philosophers love, but that actual human experience contradicts. Some of the most passionate, creative, loving people I've known have also been remarkably content with their lives. Content or complacent? There's a difference between the two, though I suspect you'd argue that any contentment eventually becomes complacency. Samuel smiled grimly. Now you're beginning to understand my position. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and somewhere in the distance a police siren wailed through the night. Both men fell silent, each contemplating the gulf between their worldviews. Samuel pushed his coffee cup to the side and folded his hands on the table. Tell me about this happiness you champion. Paint me a picture of your ideal life, your philosophical garden where all anxieties disappear and contentment reigns supreme. Marcus smiled at the imagery. You speak of my garden as if it were an escape from reality, but let me tell you what I've learned about true pleasure and genuine happiness. He paused, gathering his thoughts while watching the rain streak down the diner's windows. Imagine a person who has learned to distinguish between necessary and unnecessary desires. They understand that the body needs food, shelter, companionship. These are natural needs that, when met simply and without excess, provide genuine satisfaction. Simple enough, Samuel said, but surely you don't believe life is just about meeting basic needs? Of course not. But here's where most people go wrong. They think happiness means accumulating more pleasures, more possessions, more experiences. They chase after honors and fame and romantic conquests, thinking these will make them happy. Instead, these pursuits create endless anxiety because they depend on things outside our control. Samuel leaned forward. So, your solution is to want less. My solution is to want wisely. Take friendship, for example. I believe deep, genuine friendships are one of life's greatest pleasures. Not networking or social climbing, but real connection with people who know you completely and accept you anyway. These relationships provide security, joy, intellectual stimulation. They're intrinsically valuable. And when those friends betray you, when they die, when circumstances separate you from them, Marcus met his gaze steadily. Then we grieve, we feel pain, we acknowledge loss. I never said the philosophical life eliminates all suffering. I said it eliminates unnecessary suffering. The pain of losing someone you love is necessary pain. It's the price of having loved. But the anxiety that comes from constantly fearing that loss, or the bitterness that comes from refusing to love again, that's unnecessary suffering. Samuel stirred his coffee thoughtfully. You make it sound so rational, so manageable. But what about the deeper questions? What about meaning? What about purpose? Does your philosophy have anything to say about why we exist? It says we exist to flourish as human beings, to experience the full range of what life offers, pleasure and pain, joy and sorrow, solitude and connection, but to do so with wisdom, moderation, and appreciation. That's not meaning, that's just sophisticated hedonism. Marcus's eyes flashed. Hedonism? You think I'm advocating for shallow pleasure-seeking? Let me tell you what I mean by pleasure. He leaned forward, his usually gentle demeanor taking on an intensity that matched Samuel's. The highest pleasures are those of the mind and spirit, the joy of understanding something new, the satisfaction of helping another person, the peace that comes from accepting what cannot be changed. These aren't selfish indulgences, they're the fruits of a life lived with intention and wisdom. But they're still fundamentally about your own experience, your own satisfaction, Samuel pressed. Where's the acknowledgement of your responsibility to others? Where's the recognition that authentic existence might require sacrifice, might demand that you choose something other than your own happiness? Who says my happiness and my responsibility to others are in conflict? The person who has achieved genuine contentment, who isn't driven by ego or desperate need, is far more capable of genuine service to others than someone tormented by their own inner demons. Samuel laughed, but there was no humor in it. Ah, so your contentment is actually a form of moral superiority? You've transcended the petty anxieties that plague the rest of us, and from your elevated position, you can help the poor suffering masses. That's not what I said, and it's not what I meant. Marcus's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath. I'm saying that anxiety and despair are not virtues in themselves. They don't automatically make you more authentic or more morally sensitive. Sometimes they just make you paralyzed and self-absorbed. And sometimes contentment makes you blind to injustice and complacent about suffering. Only if it's false contentment, built on ignorance or privilege. True philosophical contentment comes from engaging fully with reality, including its injustices and sufferings, but choosing to respond with wisdom rather than despair. Samuel was quiet for a moment, then spoke more softly. Tell me honestly, have you ever experienced real despair? Have you ever felt the ground of existence crack beneath your feet, leaving you staring into an abyss of meaninglessness? Marcus considered the question carefully. I've experienced profound loss, yes. I've faced mortality, my own and others. I've confronted the possibility that nothing I do matters in any ultimate sense. But I've also learned that meaning doesn't have to be ultimate to be real. The meaning I create through my choices, my relationships, my small contributions to reducing suffering and increasing joy, that meaning is sufficient. Sufficient for you, perhaps. But what about those who can't rest in such modest meanings? What about those whose very nature demands something absolute, something unconditional? I think those people are often running from the very human condition you claim to embrace. The need for absolute meaning, for unconditional truth. Isn't that its own form of escape? Its own refusal to accept the limitations of human existence? Samuel stared at him for a long moment. You're more subtle than I initially thought, and you're more tormented than necessary, in my opinion. The waitress had disappeared into the back, leaving them alone in the fluorescent-lit space. Outside, the city slept fitfully, and dawn was still hours away. Samuel pushed back from the table and stretched, his joints cracking audibly in the quiet diner. You want to know about despair, about what you call unnecessary suffering. Let me tell you about a different kind of sickness. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the empty street. There's a sickness that affects the human spirit, not the body, but the self. It's the sickness of being afraid to be yourself, or of desperately wanting to be someone else, or of not knowing who you really are at all. Marcus turned in his seat to watch him. And you think this sickness is beneficial? I think it's inevitable for anyone who takes existence seriously. Samuel's reflection ghosted across the window glass. Most people live their entire lives without ever becoming individuals. They do what's expected. They follow the crowd. They choose paths that have been pre-approved by society or tradition or, yes, by philosophy, including my philosophy, especially your philosophy. You offer people a way to be content with themselves without ever having to face the terrifying question of who they actually are versus who they might become. Samuel returned to the booth but remained standing. Let me ask you something. When you speak of your contentment, your tranquility, your wise acceptance of limitation, who decided what your limitations are? Who determined what should make you happy? Marcus frowned. I did, through careful thought and experience. Did you? Or did you accept a pre-packaged philosophy that promised to make life easier to bear? When you say you've learned to want wisely, who taught you what to want? When you say you've found peace in simple pleasures, who defined what should be considered a simple pleasure? Are you suggesting that any philosophical framework is inherently inauthentic? I'm suggesting that most philosophical frameworks are designed to help people avoid the fundamental anxiety of choice. They provide ready-made answers to questions that each individual must answer for themselves. Samuel finally sat back down, his intensity seeming to fill the small booth. Here's what I mean by despair, by the sickness unto death. It's the condition of a self that refuses to be itself. And before you can refuse to be yourself, you have to discover who that self actually is. And how does one make this discovery? Through anxiety, through crisis, through moments when all your comfortable assumptions crumble and you're forced to choose without any guarantee that you're choosing correctly. The person who has never experienced real despair has never been forced to take responsibility for their own existence. Marcus shook his head. But that assumes that anxiety and crisis are the only paths to self-knowledge. What about the person who discovers themselves through joy, through love, through creative expression? Why must authentic existence be built on suffering? Because joy and love and creative expression, when they come too easily, can become forms of hiding. They can become ways of avoiding the harder questions. The anxiety I speak of isn't suffering for its own sake. It's the anxiety that comes from recognizing your absolute freedom and absolute responsibility. Absolute responsibility for what? For becoming who you are. For choosing, moment by moment, what kind of person to be. For taking ownership of your life instead of just drifting along on currents of pleasure and pain. Marcus poured more honey into his coffee, stirring slowly. You make it sound as though anyone who isn't constantly anxious is somehow sleepwalking through life. Not constantly anxious, but willing to face anxiety when authentic choice demands it. Tell me, have you ever made a decision that went against everything that would normally make you happy? Have you ever chosen a path that led away from contentment because you felt called to something more important than your own peace of mind? The question hung between them. Marcus considered it seriously, his expression growing more thoughtful. I've made difficult choices, yes. I've given up things I wanted for the sake of others. I've endured hardship when I believed it was necessary. But did you ever choose something without knowing whether it was the right choice? Did you ever leap into uncertainty? Not because you had calculated that it would ultimately lead to happiness, but because something in you demanded that particular choice regardless of the consequences. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. You're asking whether I've ever acted on faith. I'm asking whether you've ever truly chosen, as opposed to simply following the logical implications of your philosophical commitments. And you believe that true choice can only happen in moments of anxiety and uncertainty. Samuel leaned forward. I believe that as long as you know exactly why you're making a choice, as long as you can justify it according to some pre-existing framework, you're not really choosing. You're just executing a program. That sounds like a recipe for chaos. Sometimes chaos is more honest than false order. Sometimes the person who admits they don't know what they're doing is closer to truth than the person who has all the answers. The diner's kitchen had gone quiet. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed muted. Both men sat in contemplation, each seeing something troubling in the other's position. Let me ask you something, Marcus said finally. This authentic existence you advocate, what does it actually look like? If someone followed your philosophy, what kind of life would they lead? Samuel smiled grimly. That's exactly the wrong question. The moment I tell you what authentic existence looks like, it ceases to be authentic for you. Authenticity can't be prescribed or described in advance. It can only be lived, one choice at a time by each individual taking responsibility for their own becoming. How convenient. A philosophy that can never be criticized because it refuses to specify any actual content. And how convenient. A philosophy that promises happiness to anyone willing to follow its simple rules. No messy individual responsibility required. They stared at each other across the table, the fundamental divide between their worldviews seeming wider than ever. The tension in the diner had become almost palpable. Marcus set down his coffee cup with deliberate care, while Samuel's hands moved restlessly across the table surface, as if trying to grasp something just out of reach. You know what I think, Marcus said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before. I think your philosophy is a luxury that only works for people who have never experienced real suffering. Samuel's eyebrows shot up. Excuse me? You sit there talking about the virtue of anxiety, the authenticity of despair, the necessity of crisis, but these are intellectual games. Tell me, have you ever been truly hungry? Have you ever watched someone you love die slowly from disease? Have you ever lived with chronic pain or crippling depression? That's hardly relevant to... It's completely relevant. Marcus's voice rose for the first time all evening. Because when you're actually suffering, really suffering, your philosophical anxiety about authentic choice becomes a cruel joke. The mother working 3 jobs to feed her children isn't concerned with becoming her authentic self. She's concerned with survival. And if she can find moments of genuine happiness, moments of real peace, then that's not philosophical cowardice. That's human resilience. Samuel's face flushed. Now you're being deliberately obtuse. I never said that people shouldn't seek relief from genuine hardship. I'm talking about the existential questions that remain even after basic needs are met. Are you? Because it sounds to me like you're valorizing suffering, making it into some kind of spiritual achievement. As if the person who can't sleep at night because they're wrestling with the meaninglessness of existence is somehow more authentic than the person who finds genuine joy in their work, their relationships, their daily life. I'm not valorizing suffering. I'm refusing to pathologize it. Your philosophy treats anxiety and despair as problems to be solved, rather than potentially meaningful responses to the human condition. Because they are problems to be solved, or at least problems to be managed, worked with, integrated into a life that still contains joy and peace and connection. Samuel stood up abruptly, beginning to pace beside the table. But that's exactly what I mean about avoiding the depths. You want to manage anxiety, to integrate it into some comfortable hole where everything makes sense and nothing threatens your equilibrium. And you want to dive so deep into those depths that you forget there's a surface where people actually live their lives. The surface is an illusion. The surface is where love happens. It's where children play and friends laugh and people create beautiful things. Your depths may be philosophically interesting, but they're not where most of human goodness occurs. Samuel stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. You think I'm against love, against joy, against beauty? I think you're suspicious of them. I think you can't accept that they might be exactly what they appear to be, good things that make life worth living, without needing to be justified by some deeper existential framework. And I think you use them as anesthetics to avoid confronting the fundamental questions of existence. The accusation hung in the air between them. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a recognition that they had moved beyond philosophical disagreement into something more personal. Let me tell you about anesthetics, Marcus said quietly. I once knew a man who was so committed to feeling every ounce of existential anguish that he forgot how to comfort his crying child. He was so busy being authentic that he became incapable of simple kindness. His wife left him, his friends stopped calling, and he ended up alone with his precious anxiety, congratulating himself on his philosophical integrity while everyone else got on with the business of living. Samuel's face went pale. You're describing a caricature, am I? Because it sounds to me like your philosophy, taken to its logical conclusion, makes normal human happiness impossible. If every moment of contentment is potentially inauthentic, if every peaceful feeling might be a form of hiding, then what's left? Permanent crisis? Endless self-examination? The inability to ever rest in the goodness of life? What's left is the possibility of becoming a real individual instead of just another product of social conditioning and philosophical programming. At what cost? And for what purpose? What good is an authentic individual who can't experience simple happiness, who can't offer comfort to others, who treats every moment of peace as a potential betrayal of their philosophical commitments? Samuel sat back down heavily. You make it sound impossible to be both authentic and happy. No, I make it sound like your definition of authenticity is incompatible with normal human flourishing, and I wonder if that's because you've confused complexity with profundity, torment with insight. And I wonder if you've confused contentment with wisdom, simplicity with depth. They glared at each other across the small table. The waitress emerged from the back room, took one look at their faces, and retreated without offering more coffee. Tell me something, Samuel said after a long pause. If your philosophy is so superior, if happiness really is the goal of human existence, then why are you here at 2 a.m. arguing with a stranger instead of home in bed, contentedly asleep? Marcus considered this. Maybe because some arguments are worth having. Maybe because even a content person can be stirred by ideas that matter. Or maybe because your contentment isn't as complete as you claim. Maybe something in you recognizes the truth in what I'm saying, even if you don't want to admit it. Or maybe I'm here because I've learned that real wisdom sometimes requires engaging with viewpoints that challenge your own, even when, especially when, those viewpoints make you uncomfortable. Samuel leaned back in his seat. Uncomfortable? Yes, I imagine this conversation has been uncomfortable for you. Has it been comfortable for you? Nothing worthwhile ever is. They fell silent again, both men recognizing that they had reached some kind of impasse. The philosophical distance between them seemed vast, but something else had emerged in their heated exchange, a grudging respect, perhaps, or at least a recognition that neither position was as simple as it had initially appeared. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional car passing on the wet street outside. Both men seemed suddenly exhausted, as if their passionate exchange had drained them of their fighting energy. Marcus was the first to speak, his voice softer now. You know, There's something we haven't talked about. What's that? Why this matters so much to both of us? I mean, here we are, two strangers in an all-night diner, arguing about happiness and authenticity as if our lives depended on it. Samuel looked out the window at the pre-dawn darkness. Maybe they do depend on it. Maybe these questions about how to live are the only ones that really matter. But that's just it. We both think these questions matter enormously. We both believe that philosophy should be lived, not just discussed. We're not academic dilettantes playing intellectual games. No, Samuel agreed slowly. We're not. Marcus traced patterns on the table with his finger. I've been thinking about what you said earlier, about anxiety and choice. And I have to admit, there's something in it that resonates even if I don't like your conclusions. Oh? The people I most admire, the ones who have genuinely changed the world for the better, they've all had to make choices without guarantees. They've had to act on incomplete information, to risk being wrong to move forward despite uncertainty. Samuel nodded. Yes, that's part of what I mean by authentic existence. But here's what troubles me about your approach. It seems to treat anxiety and uncertainty as ends in themselves, rather than as sometimes necessary aspects of living fully. The civil rights leader who faces down hatred and violence isn't doing it because they love anxiety. They're doing it because they love justice, because they can envision a world with less suffering. I never said anxiety was an end in itself, didn't you? Because the way you talk about it, any resolution of anxiety, any achievement of peace or contentment becomes suspect. It's as if the only authentic state is perpetual questioning, permanent uncertainty. Samuel was quiet for a moment, considering this. Perhaps I have overemphasized the negative aspects, but I still maintain that most people flee from anxiety too quickly, that they settle for false solutions rather than sitting with difficult questions long enough to find real answers. And I maintain that some people create unnecessary anxiety by refusing to accept that some questions have good enough answers, that some problems have workable solutions, that some forms of happiness are genuine and worthy of pursuit. Good enough answers. That phrase encapsulates everything I find troubling about your philosophy. And your refusal to accept good enough answers encapsulates everything I find troubling about yours. They smiled at each other then, recognizing the symmetry of their disagreement. You know what's interesting? Marcus said. We both started this conversation assuming the other person was somehow less serious about life, less committed to living fully. But I'm beginning to think we're both trying to solve the same fundamental problem, which is how to live as fully conscious human beings in a world that often seems designed to promote unconsciousness. How to maintain integrity and depth in the face of pressures toward superficiality and conformity. Samuel leaned forward. Yes, that's exactly it. We've just identified different threats and different solutions. You see happiness as the primary threat, as something that lulls people into complacency and prevents them from becoming who they really are. And you see unnecessary suffering as the primary threat, as something that prevents people from appreciating the goodness that's actually available to them. But what if we're both partially right? What if the threats we're each worried about are real, but neither of us has the complete solution? Samuel considered this. What would that look like? Maybe it would look like recognizing that both contentment and questioning have their place, that there are times when the wise thing is to accept what you have and find peace, and times when the wise thing is to reject what you have and seek something more authentic.